The next item of business is debate on motion 20882 in the name of Monica Lennon on standing up for NHS staff and patients. Would those members who wish to take part in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Monica Lennon to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am grateful to have the opportunity to use Scottish Labour's debate time today to stand up for our NHS. The motion is titled Standing Up for NHS Staff and Patients and highlights some of the key challenges and risks facing our health service today. Governance issues and resource pressures are unprecedented, putting our most precious public service in jeopardy. This deserves the full attention of Parliament, and not just for a couple of hours, because we all rely on the NHS. We're all grateful to the NHS, and we all have constituents who are lobbying us to raise their experiences in Parliament, because it's now a troubling reality that our health service is not always available to us at the point of need. Families bereaved by suicide and Tayside have told us this. Chronic pain patients travelling from all across Scotland have told us this. Staff whistleblowers in Glasgow, Highland, Ayrshire, Lothian and elsewhere have told us this. Organisations worried that delays in diagnosing cancer are risking survival rates, including Cancer Research UK and this Parliament's cross-party group on cancer, have told us this. And of course, Audit Scotland has warned that the Scottish Government's 2020 vision for the NHS will not be met. Alison Johnson nailed it in her questions to the First Minister before recess when she outlined the growing gap between resource and demand and the pressure that our amazing NHS staff are under. The Green Amendment rightly highlights the challenges faced in achieving the 2020 vision, which is in no small part due to the growing gap between available resources and growing pressures. So we will gladly support Alison Johnson's amendment. And Miles Briggs, in his amendment, rightly draws attention to staff well-being. And many of us attended a roundtable hosted by Miles Briggs in Parliament when Brian Conley, the father of Lauren Conley, a junior doctor from East Kilbride who died on her way home from work, addressed Parliament and asked us to do something to not only help junior doctors, but everyone on the front line in our health service. Minutes from the Scottish Government Working Group looking at this indicated that to achieve the 48-hour working week would not be possible without a 35% increase in junior doctor numbers to maintain safe staffing levels. That's an approximate increase of 2,200 more doctors. We're happy to work on a cross-party basis on issues like this to improve staff well-being and the working culture within our NHS, and we will support the amendment tabled by Miles Briggs. And to the Scottish Government, I say we want to work with you too. I urge ministers to be more willing to work with opposition parties to address these fundamental concerns about working culture and the impact of resource pressures. And today, we've had many briefings, but including from the BMA and the RCN. They're very clear on the challenges and the solutions. No more sticking plasters. We need to address immediate problems like long waiting times, delayed discharge, but we need strong leadership, governance and a culture that values collaboration, openness and transparency. That's why it was disappointing to see the Scottish Government attempt to wreck our motion today. The motion reflects the serious concerns of patients and families, NHS staff, trade unions and professional bodies, and third sector groups who often fill the gaps and pick up the pieces when people are let down. Yet ministers delete all of these concerns in their amendment. This nothing to see here attitude is an insult to patients and staff. Because let's look at the laundry list of problems on the Cabinet Secretary's desk. The Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the sick kids in Edinburgh need no further commentary. Waiting times, the SNP's legal 12-week waiting time guarantee has been broken over 250,000 times. The Cabinet Secretary's much flaunted waiting times improvement plan has missed its promised milestones and abjectly failed to improve patient waiting times. Instead, they have got worse. The 62-day cancer waiting time target has not been met since 2012. The most recent statistics show that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Lothian also failed to meet the 31-day cancer treatment time target. On CAMS, the 18-week waiting time target has not been met when Nicola Sturgeon has been First Minister. And last year, over 5,000 young people waited too long. Most recent figures showed performance falling again, with more than a third of young people waiting more than 18 weeks for a first appointment. Cancelled operations in 2019, almost 7,000 operations cancelled because hospitals could not cope. And despite repeated promises to end delayed discharge, patients are still spending thousands of unnecessary days in hospital when they should be at home or in the community. Figures for December showed a 6% increase compared to the year before, and delays to hospital discharge have cost the NHS almost £200 million since the current Cabinet Secretary took up post. And I want to mention chronic pain. Thousands of patients living with chronic pain conditions are regularly forced to wait over 4 months to get a first appointment at a pain clinic. But last financial year, services only received £27,000 in additional waiting times improvement funding. Dorothy Grace Elder and members of the cross-party group on chronic pain are having to pursue answers through freedom of information requests just to get standard information on waiting times. And I pay tribute to them and patients like Catherine Hughes, who are exhausted but are fighting the good fight because they don't want other patients to go through this. And I urge the Cabinet Secretary to find the time to meet with the group and the patients. And we know that many issues in our health service have only come to light thanks to the tenacity of brave whistleblowers and patients and journalists who have asked the hard questions and not been fobbed off by the Health Board and Scottish Government spin. I pay tribute to families affected by the tragedies and serious events at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. They have shown us what courage looks like. And I want to pick up on, there's many journalists who are involved in this, but I've been speaking to Hannah Roger from the Herald and Herald on Sunday, and she has spent more than a year using freedom of information to try and access specific information about the handling of outbreaks at the Queen Elizabeth, and has faced repeated resistance from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And it's concerning that other bodies, including Health Protection Scotland, are following suit in their reluctance to provide information. More hiding behind patient confidentiality and legal excuses, yet they break these exemptions when the timing suits to serve their own spin or narrative. Hannah had been told by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde there was nothing new in the leaked reports that she was passed, detailing the warnings about wards not being purpose-built, the ventilation system throughout the whole campus, maybe exacerbating the spread of infection, and concerns that information was missing from building logs. And then we got to a point where the Cabinet Secretary did call a public inquiry, but it shouldn't have taken a year of campaigners and journalists and others meeting brick walls. It feels like patients and families are taking on the medical establishment. In fact, at times it's like a medical mafia. You know, speaking out and standing up against the shocking treatment by the Health Board. And some staff have lost their jobs. That's the reality. And worryingly, these problems with transparency, they're not isolated to one health board or one part of Scotland. From our benches, Sarah Boyack, Daniel Johnson and Anas Sarwar will be speaking in the debate, and they've all been tenacious in standing up for patients and staff in their own areas. And we do have the ridiculous and scandalous situation of the New Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh lying empty, unable to treat a single patient, even though the Health Board are still paying out millions of pounds to the contractor for it. And it's right that there will be a public inquiry into the construction of the hospital in Glasgow and in Edinburgh. The dots need to be joined. We need to have accountability. Lessons must be learned. But in other health boards, well, if you take NHS Tayside, for example, so many families have had their lives turned upside down by the tragedy of suicide. Families have felt shut out and let down by the decisions of that health board. And the Strang report, which we discussed in the chamber before recess, is a hopeful step towards really changing this for good. Miles Briggs, in his amendment on the Sturrock Review, highlights this bullying and harassment culture in our NHS that really needs to be stamped out. The Strang report, which I mentioned, again was fuelled by the courage of families who have spoken out. Some of them are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder themselves. So I pay tribute to Gillian Murray and to Mandy McLaren and others. But it's not just a Tayside issue. The Mental Health Minister is aware that we have patients and constituents in Lanarkshire who are saying the same things. That's why Gillian Murray in Tayside is working with Karen McKeown in Lanarkshire to petition this Parliament to make sure that this fragmentation between mental health and substance use ends, so that we get to a point where there is no wrong door. We are far away from that. And in the motion, we talk about health boards being in special measures. There is nothing special about that. The only thing spectacular about it is the fact it's become so unprecedented. So many opportunities missed to step in and to support boards and to really have a deep dive into what some of the problems are. We've had so many chief executives and chairs resign or be moved on, and it feels like a game of NHS musical chairs. We need a plan for reform, not a government that shies away from acknowledging the challenges we face. We need the government to be open and transparent, to set the bar so that our health boards operate at that level. We must end the culture of secrecy. That's why I'm disappointed the government has deleted all of these concerns in their amendment, because I want the people of Scotland to know that not just the Labour Party or all of us as a Parliament, with the support of this government, will stand up for the NHS no matter what. Stand up for patients and for staff. I move the motion in my name.
I now call Jean Freeman to speak to and move Amendment 20882.3 for up to 8 minutes. Please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to take part in the debate and move the amendment in my name. We are all living longer lives now, and that is indeed good news. It's a testament to the work of our NHS that it has undertaken throughout the lives of every single person in this chamber. But this change in population brings challenges, long-term conditions and comorbidities, all placing significant demands on health and social care. That is one of the reasons why it is so vital for both our society as a whole and our health and care service in particular that we continue to attract people to come and work here in Scotland. Our health boards do face difficulties in recruitment to certain specialists in our services in certain areas, and we do work with them to try and address these, but their job and ours is made harder because of the additional complexities imposed on us by Brexit, by the UK government's changes to pension and taxation, and potentially now through an even more draconian immigration system that looks likely to be imposed against Scotland's needs and against Scotland's choice. Yes.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving me, but I struggle to understand how increases in demand led to bad decision-making regarding the building of 2 hospitals at both ends of the M8.
Jean Freeman.
And if I'd been suggesting that, then I would have struggled with you too, but I'm 1 minute 13 in, so give me a moment. Our health boards, where our system falls short of our expectations, we do demand action is taken to address it, because the consequences of shortcomings can be terrible. In the case of the sick kids in Edinburgh, the impact includes a cost to the public purse. Where bullying has taken place, the impact has clearly been to the detriment of staff who are trying to work to care for their fellow citizens. And in the most tragic circumstances, shortcomings have ultimately seen the loss of life. I cannot begin to imagine the pain experienced by families who've lost loved ones in this way, and in particular when that loss is a child. As the Health Secretary, let me say again how sorry I am that anyone should have had these experiences. They are not acceptable, they must be addressed, and we are doing that. There are members in this chamber, including Mr Sarwar and Ms Bailey, who have raised with me incredibly serious issues and have helped play a part in starting to see them addressed. Contributions like theirs help inform our ongoing monitoring of boards through the escalation framework and change the level of support and direction that boards get so that we can fix problems and failings. As I've said before, I welcome anyone who has constructive proposals to improve our health service for the benefit of patients, families and staff. But sadly, Ms Lennon's motion today has no such proposals. It calls for two things only. She calls for ministers to chair annual board reviews. We do. And it calls for this Parliament to be able to call witnesses, and it can. So if Ms Lennon has serious proposals on improving services, I will listen. But if the only contribution remains weak lines for press releases, then I don't think we're going to get very far. 3 years ago, in February 2017, no, let me finish. 3 years ago, in February 2017, Labour announced that they were establishing an NHS Workforce Commission. 3 years ago. 3 years on, what is that commission proposing in terms of workforce? Nothing. Nothing. In those 3 years, we've produced workforce plans for acute care, primary care, social care. We've worked with COSLA to produce an overarching workforce plan which draws all of that together. We've seen 2,700 whole-time equivalent more staff join our NHS, an increase of 2%. And we've passed the most comprehensive safe staff legislation anywhere in the UK. Overall, under the SNP, NHS staff numbers are up by 11.3%. That's over 14,300 more whole-time equivalent staff working in our NHS to deliver the quality of services our citizens need. Yes.
Monica Lennon.
Thank you to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. What we have been busy doing is meeting the people that can't get in front of the Cabinet Secretary, who claim to have an open door, who claim to that she made it a priority that she would appoint staff whistleblowing champions. We're only seeing it happen now. But we are working with stakeholders on policy development. We do have an election next year, but there's been no press release from us to trail this debate. But what I would say that this is an insult to all of the people that I mentioned in my opening remark. More spin, more denial. Take responsibility. You've been in charge for 13 years.
Jean Freeman.
It is absolutely none of those things, Ms Lennon, because see all that long list that you produced? That is a list of action that we are taking. Those are people that I have met. And I can manage to both meet people, devise policy and lead our NHS. If you would like to try to do some of that, then we might have a constructive discussion. I want no more intervention.
Excuse me, ladies. Can I just say, you do not have private conversations. You do not have arguments across the chamber. Everything comes through me. Ms Freeman.
My apologies, Presiding Officer. Under this government since 2006-07, the annual resource investment in health has risen by 62.9%, and our draft budget for 2020-21 will take total health spending to over £15 billion, a rise of 4.2% over and above the demand that we recognised in our medium-term financial framework. But if we had seen Labour's own manifesto health spending, then our health spending would be down by £1.4 billion in this year. Investment, of course, must be matched with reform. And while social care reform in England remains in the long grass, we've backed integration, not by warm words, but in our partnership with COSLA and the additional resources proposed in the budget, taking our total investment in health and social care partnerships to over £9.4 billion. So investment in our NHS and in our most valuable resource of health staff is vital, and it is producing improvements. Not as fast as we want, but real, tangible and sustainable improvement. In the year to September 2019, outpatients waiting over 12 weeks down by 14%, a 50% reduction in patients waiting over 6 weeks for scopes, and an 18% reduction in patients waiting for the 8 key diagnostic tests. Now, I've got a lot to get through. 95% performance for the 31-day cancer has been met, and improvements are coming through on the 62-day target. Absolutely, there is more to do, but these improvements should neither be ignored nor dismissed. And across our NHS, every day, there is innovation in home-based hypertension testing linked to social prescribing, in the growing numbers of patients using Attend Anywhere or NHS Near Me, in developments in optometry and a community pharmacy, in robotic surgery and in orthopaedic inpatient stays and much more. Our job is to harness that innovation, gather the evidence of what works and then enable the spread, as we did only yesterday using the NHS Lanarkshire Hospital at Home model. So, Presiding Officer, I am not denying challenges or problems, but what I am clear about is that the whole system approach we are taking and the whole system engagement we are nurturing, from our work with local authorities to our engagement with Royal Colleges, regulatory bodies and third sector organisations, that is the right approach. And what I ask from opposition colleagues is recognition of the progress our NHS staff are delivering, and that criticism and challenge should come alongside constructive engagement, ideas and mature discussion. Our NHS, the staff who dedicate their lives to it, and the patients who need it deserve nothing less from any one of us.
I now call on Miles Briggs to speak to and move Amendment 20882.1 for up to 7 minutes. Please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I think for anyone who's watched this debate so far out in the real world, they'll just not think that the Cabinet Secretary actually has a real grasp of what's going on in our health service. Turning up for a photo call is one thing, but the daily emails which I receive from our NHS workforce show the trouble which they are in, and this Cabinet Secretary often isn't listening. Now, I welcome today's debate and believe it builds on the debate which I led in this chamber in April, standing up for all those who work in our health service. As in last April's debate, I want to begin by putting on record my party's gratitude to and the support for each and every one of our NHS staff across Scotland. Our NHS staff are fundamentally our NHS, and they are the most valuable resource we have. They're incredibly hard-working, providing each and every one of our constituents with first-class healthcare, despite often the pressures put on them by ministers. I'm disappointed that since last April's debate, the Scottish Government hasn't done more to introduce some of the positive measures which were suggested in that debate to address staff workforce issues, workload concerns and working conditions to tackle the severe staff shortages which our NHS is facing. Monica Lennon earlier suggested and mentioned the junior doctors' working hours issue. I've raised this before, and I was pleased last year to host a round table here in Parliament with Brian Connolly, the father of a 23-year-old junior doctor who sadly was killed driving home after a 12-hour night shift. Now, I want to pay tribute again to Mr Connolly's campaigning on this issue, but we need to see action on this. And I'd be grateful if ministers would use this debate in closing to actually put in place what work the expert working group, which was being chaired by Professor Kachia, what is actually coming out of that work. We could have heard that already, and I think it's important for members across this chamber and junior doctors who are maybe even here in the public gallery to understand where the government are going with that. Now, I've given my backing to the Royal College of Anaesthetists' Excellent Fight Fatigue campaign. That is a solution-based suggestion to support our NHS staff. Now, the BMA and RCN's briefings for today's debate highlight some real workforce concerns, which I think we should all be very acutely aware of. The survey, the employment survey RCN undertook, shows that 60% of respondents agree that they're under too much pressure at work, while 70% report that they work over the contracted hours at least once a week, with 52% working beyond their contracted hours in every single shift that they turn up to a hospital. This demonstrates just how much needs to be done to support our NHS staff across Scotland. We need to look at such support holistically, I believe, and this means looking at pre- and post-shift work as well. Having rest facilities in hospitals and properly timetabled rotas for staff to get a break are measures that could improve NHS staff well-being, effectiveness and, most importantly, their safety now. We've been calling for the Scottish Government to introduce sleep pods, for example, within hospital campuses where staff can rest before heading home or starting shifts. And I'd urge ministers to work with our health boards across Scotland to actually take this forward. We want to see every health board providing quality mental health and financial support and advice as well to NHS staff. With NHS staff absentee rates at such high levels, we really do need to look to invest now in better mental health support for our NHS workforce. Parking and difficulties around parking in some cases also are issues which are raised constantly with me. And hospitals significantly here in Edinburgh, in Glasgow and at Nine Wells still are having to face parking charges for NHS staff. Now, there is a solution to this which the government can take forward, which Scottish Conservatives have put forward, campaigning to actually end this unfair charging. And a refund scheme is something I hope everyone across this chamber for NHS staff can get behind. Now, the Scottish Government proposed budget doesn't include that, but that's something we can do and is costed, and something I hope ministers will actually look to implement. For the NHS staff who work at these sites still paying these charges, it has to come to an end, and ministers have these powers and have had them for 13 years. In addition, we want to see a comprehensive national review of parking as well for patients. Because in so many cases, here in Edinburgh, I know from my own mailbag, when people go to hospital, they find the stress of parking or no capacity to park a significant issue. And that's something I think we can address as a parliament, and money can be made available, given the £7 million in Barnett consequentials coming to this parliament for parking. And that's something I hope ministers will also try to take forward. Now, I want, very briefly, yeah.
Jean Freeman.
Would the member accept two things and clarify one thing for me? Would he accept it was actually an SNP government that abolished parking charges in those hospitals which we are not obliged to continue to pay over £240 million a year for PFI contracts? Secondly, would he accept that our approach on climate change actually should produce some significant improvements so that people perhaps no longer need to use their cars so much, as does Attend Anywhere and Near Me? And thirdly, would he clarify that the £700 million he claims is coming from Barnett consequentials is coming for car parking, or is it for something else?
You can have the extra time.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. So on your first point, yes, this has been. In 3 hospitals, though, this is not the case. We're seeing NHS staff still having to pay to park. So we can do something about that. We can refund staff their parking. That's what is now planned to take place in England and Wales. And on the back of that, £7 million will come to this Parliament in Barnett consequentials because of parking which staff will not pay in England and Wales. Now, ministers can decide in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Nine Wells to stop making staff pay for that and use that money, or to continue to see that in place. I don't believe an NHS staff in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Nine Wells should continue to pay these parking fees. Now, I repeat the call that the government should bring forward a full debate as well around the Sturrock review without further delay, a call which my Highlands and Islands colleague Edward Mountain has also rightly repeatedly made. On the Scottish Government's failure to meet a raft of NHS targets and its appalling oversight of key NHS infrastructure projects, I associate myself to the points and the content of Monica Lennon's motion as well. Speaking to my constituents across Edinburgh and Lothian, I'm always struck by the fact that they are increasingly losing confidence in the SNP's ability to actually lead and manage our NHS. And that shouldn't be of any surprise to ministers when they look at all the problems which are mounting up. But there are innovative new solutions which we can take forward if ministers would look towards taking these and listening across Parliament. As co-convener of the Parliament's cross-party group on cancer with Anna Sarwar, I've also highlighted in recent months the report which we put forward, pointing to survival of cancer being impacted by the lack of workforce and the SNP government's work around tackling cancer not having a long-term approach. As Monica Lennon's outlined, for chronic pain patients across our country, they feel they are completely ignored and they've had enough. They want to see action to address chronic pain in this country. Now, we need to take that forward, and this Parliament needs to take a serious role in how people who suffer from chronic pain access services in Scotland, because for so many of our fellow Scots who have chronic pain, they are fighting day in, day out just to be believed. So to conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, I hope that ministers will use this debate to actually understand the problems facing our health service, to listen to the calls from across this Parliament for cross-party action. I welcome today's debate. It's a debate we should all be rightly scrutinising the failing record of this government and our NHS, and I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
I now call Alison Johnson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank the Labour Party for bringing these issues to the Chamber today. Given the challenges that our health service has been facing in the past few months, this debate is extremely timely. I also would like to pay tribute to our incredible health service staff who are working in increasingly tough conditions and still managing to deliver excellent care. And I think it is important to acknowledge this. Audit Scotland's report on the NHS, published in October, revealed that despite the existing pressures, patient safety continue to improve. The NHS in Scotland has a committed workforce that continues to provide high-quality, safe care. I am extremely grateful for this. It's essential that we in Parliament take time to highlight the challenges the NHS faces, but also to thank our dedicated healthcare staff and to celebrate the work they do. Now, I agree with the principles contained within the motion in Monica Lennon's name. It's vital that we have transparency across our public services, not least our health service, where lives are at stake. Now, my amendment, which wasn't selected, urged the Scottish Government to not only publicly report on the progress of health and social care plans, but to urgently develop a new health and social care strategy. The Scottish Government's 2020 vision, which stated that by 2020, everyone would be able to live longer, healthier lives at home or in a homely setting, has obviously not been realised. The Scottish Government needs to outline what the revised timeline is for realising its ambition. The motion also refers to the sustainability of the health service. Audit Scotland's report on the NHS, published in October, was clear that wide-scale reform is necessary to address the increasing pressure on the NHS and to reduce demand for acute services. This isn't happening, however. Delayed discharge figures are consistently poor, and between 2017-18 and 18-19, the NHS saw an increase of 2.8% in A&E attendance. Acute services are struggling at both ends of the pipeline, and patients are suffering as a result. Briefly, I have 6 minutes.
John Mason.
I thank the member very much for giving way. I mean, I agree very much with a lot of what she says. Would she accept that we'll need to disinvest in hospitals if we're going to put more money into the community?
Alison Johnson.
I think that's a very big question, Mr Mason, and one that I don't have time to cover in this debate. Now, health inequalities, which drive so much of the pressure on our NHS, they continue to permeate our society. The Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health's 2019 update on the State of Child Health report found that the proportion of children at risk of being overweight or obese surges ahead in the most deprived areas, but falls back in the least deprived. Child poverty rates are increasing and child mental health services are struggling to meet demand. So if we don't improve the health of our children, we have little hope of improving the health of our nation as a whole. And of course, while accountability for failings is essential, we need to avoid perpetuating a blame culture and ensure that NHS staff and leadership are supported and valued. As has been well described, there have been deeply concerning reports of a negative workplace culture in the health service. The departing chair of NHS Lothian, Brian Houston, stated in his resignation letter that the Health Board hasn't been treated with the values of openness and honesty, dignity and respect by some areas of the Scottish Government, and that the Board had been bringing the challenges it was facing to the Scottish Government's attention for years. The Vice Chair, Martin Hill, similarly stated that the Scottish Government contrived to put Brian in a position where he felt it necessary to resign. It's clear, very, very briefly.
Monica Lennon.
Oh, thank you. When you mentioned Brian Houston's resignation, the Minister for Mental Health rolled her eyes. Do we have complacency at the heart of government that don't take a letter as serious as Brian Houston's, which Alex Cole-Hamilton raised at topical questions, take that more seriously?
Alison. Point of order. Claire Hockey.
Presiding Officer, I find the remarks that Ms Lennon has just made towards me very insulting. What my gestures are when I am not speaking and not intervening on a colleague here, and when I'm in conversation with a colleague sitting beside me, should not concern her.
You have placed your feelings on record, Ms Hockey. We'll now go back to Ms Johnson. Alison Johnson, I shall give you extra time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I would say that it's clear that management at NHS Lothian are not feeling wholly supported or valued. Now, that is concerning in any workplace, but in our health service, which is so crucial to the health and well-being of Scotland, it is alarming. Now, failings in one health board are frequently indicative of wider issues and shouldn't be dismissed as the fault of one individual. I won't be supporting the Scottish Government's amendment as it removes any reference to staff well-being, despite abundant evidence that NHS workers are under considerable strain. We can't ignore what frontline staff are telling us. The Cabinet Secretary and I both attended the reception for the Royal College of Emergency Medicine in this building a couple of weeks ago. We can be left in no doubt about what it is like in those departments. As Miles Briggs' amendment points out, the Sturrock Review revealed a culture of bullying at NHS Highland. The independent inquiry into mental health services at NHS Tayside also revealed that some staff don't trust the organisation's motivation, experiencing a culture of fear and blame. They see a failure of the organisation to take responsibility and evidence of defensiveness and lack of transparency. So there is a disturbing pattern here. As health boards struggle to meet demand and cope with staff shortages, stress and tensions increase, and it's clear that staff are too often bearing the brunt of that. Now, these conditions will only worsen with the introduction of the UK government's post-Brexit immigration plans, which were revealed this week. The Home Secretary said this is about bringing the brightest and the best to the UK, and that the government wants to reduce the levels of people coming to the UK with low skills. This devaluation of so many of our foreign-born workers is simply appalling. People who work in the care sector have historically been low-paid and classed as low-skilled, but caring for vulnerable people with multiple complex conditions requires a really particular skill set, which we do well to appreciate. Our health and social care system relies on so-called low-skilled workers, and the UK government's refusal to acknowledge that is short-sighted at best. I will begin to close, Presiding Officer. I'll be supporting the Conservatives' amendment because it makes some valuable points about workplace culture and the Sturrock review, but the Conservatives do need to take a long, hard look at themselves and decide whether the best way to promote well-being is to devalue vital staff and worsen recruitment issues at a time when demand for NHS services has never been higher. I hope they'll work with other parties and with their government in Westminster to lessen the impacts of these new immigration rules on our health and social care services. I'm sure staff and the public don't appreciate our NHS being used as a tool with which to score political points. We must work together constructively as a parliament to better support our NHS workers because they need us and we need them. Thank you.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It often sounds slightly cliched to begin a speech like this by thanking NHS staff, but I do thank them because they have saved the lives of 2 of my 3 children on separate occasions, and that I know that they work miracles on their knees, and sometimes we ask them to do more with less, and they have my thanks, particularly the junior doctors who may be in the gallery, and indeed the Royal College of Nurses and the Nurses of Scotland, who provided us with an excellent briefing towards today's debate. I also want to pay tribute to people who don't get a lot of thanks in this, and that is the board chair, the board chief executive, and the head of the Health and Social Care Partnership in my own area. Brian Houston, Tim Davison, and Judith Proctor I have cause to work with on a nearly daily basis, and I know that they recognise the problems in their own health board. I don't hold them responsible for a lot of those, and I know that they are doing their very best. I think the loss of both, not at this time, I need to make some progress. I do recognise that the departure of Tim Davison and Brian Houston, coming as it does side by side, will create a massive leadership gulf in NHS Lothian, but I'm conscious we have some organisational memories still left there. There are warning lights, Presiding Officer, across the dashboard of our NHS, and we see these day in, day out in our constituency surgeries, whether that's in the breach of the 12-week waiting time guarantee, where people who have in sometimes abject pain are asked to wait 40 or 50 weeks for basic surgery. Despite clutching that letter that we still cruelly send them to say that they have a legal right to be seen within 12 weeks. Not only that, the systems around mailing things out to people are still stuck in the 1970s. I had a lady come see me who had a referral for suspected mouth cancer, and she was clutching the referral letter, which had an admission at the top of the letter that it was dictated in October and typed up in December. This kind of delay sitting in a dictaphone somewhere costs lives. Presiding Officer, I've also referenced Dr. Patrick Statham, who it was the first time I've ever had a consultant neurosurgeon come to my surgery to complain about delayed discharge. The fact that he is turning people away from the Western General every single week because there are insufficient inpatient beds in that hospital due to the inability of the hospital to discharge well patients into social care packages in the community. That was typified also by the constituents I've raised before several times of George Ballantyne, who was declared well and yet still had to wait 150 nights in the Liberton Hospital at a cost of £500 a night for the want of a care package that would have cost £80 a night. That is the kind of myopic problem that we have in the integration agenda, and we need all of us to address that. The problem is frankly, that we aren't valuing social care staff enough. That sort of recognition that we can pay people more to stack shelves in a supermarket than to provide round-the-clock, intimate care to some of our most vulnerable citizens is an absolute outrage, and is part of the reason there is an interruption of flow that goes throughout the health service, and that is evident also in our A&E delays and the waiting time problems that we have there. NHS Lothian, which is the board I'll speak to in my remarks, is creaking at the sides, but I don't hold the board or the social care partnership responsible. GPs are groaning under the weight of the new housing that is being forced upon Edinburgh, and those surgeries are often closing their lists to new entrants, and added to which, our population is getting older. Now, John Mason, and I will let John Mason intervene in a minute because I know he wanted to, but he asked Alison Johnson if we needed to divest from hospitals to invest in healthcare in the community. Well, I'd start by not wasting £1.4 million a month on a hospital that is currently lying empty, waiting for children. I'll take one from James if John's not ready.
Hold on, just James Dornan.
See, given we are where we are, what would you do with the hospital just now? You have to accept we are where we are, so that doesn't answer the question that John put. We'd need to get the money from somewhere just now.
Excuse me, but we seem to be having private conversations again. Could members please bear in mind everything comes through the chair? Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful for James Dornan's intervention, but part of this was baked into the fabric of the design for this build. 8 years ago, this hospital was meant to open. It was first commissioned in 2012. It was due then. And now, of course, we're not going to put people into an unsafe hospital, but we need to learn these lessons and not make them, and not put the blame for them at the feet of the chief executive and the chair of the health board, as this government has sought to do. Blame is easy. It is easy to make blame. And I'll come on to the resignation of the board chair in just 1 minute. But the cause of this fiasco was baked in 8 years ago. It could have been stopped several times. It wasn't. And I'm hopeful we'll get some answers to that in the coming inquiry. But Brian Houston, in his resignation letter, talked about the blame culture that comes from this Scottish Government to health boards around the country. He was told, and it suggests that he was told to accept the blame for the sick kids' delay by this Cabinet Secretary. He felt, and this was in his words, a rush to judgment which appears to reflect a desire for blame that is both unfair and inappropriate, and I agree with him. I'm shocked by that. I have at no point ascribed the blame for the sick kids' hospital to this Cabinet Secretary, so I'm dismayed to learn that a senior high-ranking official in the health board was meant to feel blame by her. Presiding officer, it's a culture of blame that is not new from this government. When the SNP cut funding to drug and alcohol services by £1.3 million in the capital alone, the Cabinet Secretary, her predecessor, blamed the NHS Lothian for not meeting that gap through NRAC funding. This NHS is in crisis, and the answer to none of this is further centralisation. But I will close with this. Brian Houston's resignation letter spoke to the heart of the problem in NHS Lothian when he wrote that we have consistently drawn the attention of the Scottish Government for a fundamental step change in infrastructure and capacity to serve a population that is growing at twice the Scottish average. This government has its fingers in its ears, and it is not valuing the people on the front line who are trying to make it right.
We now move to the open debate. Speeches of 6 minutes, please. It'd be appreciated if people would try and keep to time. Jackie Bailey, followed by Emma Harper.
Presiding officer, perhaps unsurprisingly, I want to focus my contribution today on NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Scotland's largest health board and one that covers the people I represent in Dumbarton constituency. Let me welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary has recognised how poor the health board is by ordering special measures for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde at stage 4 of the NHS board performance framework. Because the truth is, presiding officer, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde is failing. And even the Scottish Government recognise this. They're failing their staff, who work so hard, often with insufficient resources. They're failing patients, who are languishing on ever-increasing waiting lists. And they are failing our communities, who see services centralised away from their area, making it difficult for those who are disadvantaged to access the services they need. The Health Board used to argue that centralisation delivered better outcomes, but for the first time since records began, life expectancy in Scotland has fallen. That is a scandal in 21st century Scotland and a measure on which this SNP government should be judged and judged harshly. Let me say to the Cabinet Secretary, much as I welcome things that she's done, I also think she's been too lenient to those at the very top of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. Frankly, I've had enough, indeed.
Jean Freeman.
To the member, partly for her comments, but also for let me intervene. Will the member accept then that there is a contradiction between one member of the Labour benches arguing that I should escalate Greater Glasgow and Clyde to a higher level, and yet the Labour motion citing escalation as some indication of failure by our NHS? Is it not an indication of a government that is getting a grip of what is going wrong and acting?
Jackie Bailey.
The two, as you'll have heard my colleagues shouting, are not mutually exclusive, right? They aren't mutually exclusive. We do need action. And I am about to call for an increase in the action that's taken, because the level of complacency and downright incompetence that I have witnessed merits the escalation of special measures to stage 5, the most serious intervention possible, and frankly, the removal of the Chair and Chief Executive who have presided over these shocking series of failures. Let's not forget that these failures include children like Millie Mayne, who died needlessly in the Queen Elizabeth, Scotland's flagship hospital, because of infections due to the condition of the building. How devastating for those families. How outrageous that there appear to have been attempts to cover up the scandal. That culture of secrecy, the lack of openness and transparency, comes from the very top of the Health Board. I witnessed this firsthand when I worked alongside families that experienced the C. diff outbreak at the Vale of Leven Hospital, where 38 people died. There was an independent review, there was a public inquiry, but it would appear that the lessons from both of those have not been learnt by the Health Board. And I suspect the problems are not with the infection control team, but actually rest with the leadership at the very top that didn't act on the information they had and effectively covered up the problems. It really doesn't get more serious than this, and it's symptomatic of the wider failures at the very top of the board. Waiting times for scheduled and unscheduled care are now through the roof. Despite the additional resource being provided by the Cabinet Secretary, things appear to be getting worse, not better. Let me illustrate this. John Christie, a well-liked local teacher, was referred for a left knee replacement in June 2017. In July 2019, 2 years later, he was told he needed a hip replacement first. He went for his pre-op in October last year. Surgery is unlikely to be until August 2020. He is in so much pain that he had to be hospitalised as a result. He is now barely able to walk. 3 years on from his first referral, Mr. Christie is still waiting. That, frankly, is intolerable. Then there is Fergus McMurdo. He's 5 years old. He needs his adenoids removed. He will wait till October 2020, more than a year after being seen by the consultant for his operation. In the meantime, he's in pain, and his condition is slowing his reading development at school. Cabinet Secretary, that's the tip of the iceberg. I have hundreds of cases in my casework bag full of people being failed by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. The treatment time guarantee in that health board is simply a joke. Let me turn to the out-of-hours service at the Vale of Leven Hospital. In 2018, as you'll know, there were 82 closures due to a lack of GP cover. In 2019, it had soared to 179 closures, a 118% increase. And this is despite me challenging the Health Board, indeed the Cabinet Secretary herself challenging the Health Board at a meeting with me at the Vale of Leven Hospital in June 2019. And the problems are repeated at Inverclyde Royal as well. The Sir Lewis Ritchie review into out-of-hours reported in 2015. What have the Health Board been doing in the last 5 years? They've singularly failed to resolve the problem, and I raised out-of-hours again in this chamber in December 2019, and I was told that seven out of 70 salaried doctors had been recruited. An iceberg is currently melting faster than the speed at which Greater Glasgow and Clyde act. And the consequence of all this incompetence is that patients end up at the front door of A&E, increasing waiting times for conditions that can best be treated locally. The level of inaction and incompetence is truly outrageous. The contempt of the Chair and Chief Executive for MSPs is all too evident. They haven't bothered to hold meetings with us. No, I don't have time. They haven't bothered to hold meetings with us in over 2.5 years. It's bad enough that they ignore MSPs, but to effectively ignore the Cabinet Secretary is scandalous. There is no accountability, there's no transparency, there's a litany of failures. Cabinet Secretary, for the sake of my constituents and the NHS, which we all hold close to our hearts, sack the Chair and Chief Executive because they are out of time and they should be out of office too.
Emma Harper, followed by Annie Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate, which allows us the opportunity to discuss positively the progress being made to address many of the challenges mentioned in the Labour Party motion. As a nurse educator working on the front line of NHS until May 2016, I want to recognise the outstanding work that our dedicated, hard-working and competent NHS staff carry out day in, day out, the length and breadth of Scotland. Presiding Officer, the NHS in Scotland is our most important public resource, and we must do everything we can to ensure that it is properly funded and protected as a public service. As members will be aware, almost 50% of this Parliament's budget is spent on health. This clearly demonstrates a commitment to healthcare from this government. Indeed, in the budget announced by Kate Forbes, who I welcome as the new Cabinet Secretary for Finance, funding for the NHS in 2020-2021 will rise to more than £15 billion for the first time since this Parliament's inception. The funding will allow our health service to continue to grow its workforce, which over previous years under this government has risen by more than 14,300 whole-time equivalent staff. This increase represents doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants and many allied health professionals and should be welcomed by parties across the whole chamber. In addition to this funding, patient satisfaction in Scotland is soaring above that of other parts of the UK. 86% of people in Scotland rated their full inpatient experience positively in 2018, and 83% of people rated the overall care provided by their GP surgery as good or excellent. As well as positive patient feedback over the last 5 years, there has been a decreasing year-on-year trend in the rate of both MRSA and C. diff infection. This demonstrates that the Scottish Patient Safety Programme is working to protect patients, and as a result, we're seeing some of the lowest rates of hospital-acquired infection across the UK. Presiding Officer, when preparing for this debate today, I contacted my Westminster colleague, Philippa Whitford MP, and raised information about the Nuffield Trust research into NHS in Scotland. The research, written by Mark Dahan and Nigel Evans, is called Learning from Scotland's NHS. The key findings and themes of this research show the strength of our NHS in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK and even across the world. The report, which comprehensively compared NHS Scotland with NHS services in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, found that Scotland has a unique system of improving the quality of healthcare delivered to patients. We have a system which focuses on engaging the altruistic professional motivations of frontline staff to do better and which builds their skills to improve. The report found that success in Scotland is defined based on specific measurements of safety and effectiveness that make sense to clinicians. The vast majority of the clinicians interviewed as part of the research agreed with this report. And the report went on to indicate that Scotland's system of healthcare provides, and I quote, possible alternatives for an English system with a tendency towards too many short-term, top-down initiatives that often fail to reach the front line. Scotland's NHS also provides one possible model for a Northern Irish NHS, yet to have a pervasive commitment to quality improvement, and a Welsh system described as needing better ways to hold health boards to account while supporting them in improving care. This independent research and the findings speak for themselves and serve as an example of how the NHS in Scotland under the Scottish Government is showing leadership across the board. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned technology about reducing the need to travel to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And I know that in NHS Dumfries and Galloway, a lot of great work is being done using telemedicine approach by the respiratory team for the last 10 years now. And I know that Transform in Wigtonshire are engaging with Attend Anywhere, CoSync and Empower programmes. There is a lot of great work being done. And Alison Johnston mentioned the Royal College of Emergency Medicine event. I was the sponsor of the event and welcomed the words from Dr. David Chung and Kirsty, the doctor who spoke. She did present an overview of a really challenging work environment with many competing priorities on one particular night shift. But she also said she loved her job. She also said she loved how busy it was. Presiding Officer, I want to address a specific point. Of course I will.
Alison Johnson.
I think no one that attended that event that night could be in any doubt as to the commitment of those working in our emergency departments. But the young doctor speaking did say it's not safe. On the night that she was speaking about, she used the words that had gone through her head, it's not safe. I mean, that must be a grave concern to each and every one of us.
Emma Harper.
As a operating room nurse who worked in recovery room in sometimes really stressful, difficult environments, it is very challenging to support a safe environment sometimes. But she also said that, you know, that part of her work was what she was drawn to the emergency room environment for. So, but I agree that sometimes it's really challenging to support an environment that meets the safe or areas that's required, but everybody does try to meet these challenges in order to support the most safe, effective, person-centred care. Presiding Officer, I do want to address a specific point that the Labour motion said. We know that positive staff experience makes for a better health service overall, and I'm pleased the Scottish Government is clear that staff working in our NHS are our most important asset. And I realise the time is over 6 minutes, so I'd just like to say, Presiding Officer, that I welcome this debate and the opportunity to highlight the fantastic work that's going on in our NHS in Scotland, and we must make sure that we preserve that and keep it safe for everybody that uses it. Thank you.
Annie Wells, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is a welcome debate, and I'd like to begin with a thank you to all NHS and social care staff. At key moments throughout all of our lives, the Scottish NHS has been there to support us. And we can probably all remember a particularly compassionate doctor or nurse who helped us at a really difficult time and made sure our loved ones were looked after and comfortable. When my son was born and when my dad passed away, our NHS was there, as it has been for so many of us, at crucial moments. We are incredibly lucky to have a health service of this quality ready to help when we need it. And the backbone of our health service is, of course, its staff. Its people are the most valuable resource our NHS has, and we've got to look after those who look after us. However, under this SNP government, this is not happening. Scotland's NHS has suffered each and every year that the SNP have been in power. We all value our NHS greatly, but it has been mismanaged by this government at almost every turn. Not at the moment. I've just started. Thank you very much. I've got a lot to get through. There's the headline visible problems that everyone can see. A sick kids' hospital that was supposed to open years ago, still lying shut. Treating no patients. Staff instead having to work in older buildings and not having access to new facilities where they could do their jobs better. In my home of Glasgow, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital has gone from one scandal to another. The problems just keep coming. The handling of water contamination has been absolutely shambolic from the start. Information being withheld from a parent that the death of her child in 2017 may have been linked to water contamination. And since that death was reported, it has emerged that the Health Protection Scotland reports identified contamination risks as far back as 2016, with dozens of individual cases. Then there's the headline targets that have been missed. A 12-week treatment time guarantee that has never been met, even though Nicola Sturgeon set the target herself in 2011. 1 in 6 patients with urgent cancer referrals are waiting more than 2 months for treatment. Nearly 1 in 7 patients in A&E wait over 4 hours to be seen. 600 patients waited more than 8 hours, and 185 waited longer than 12 hours in an A&E department. How is that acceptable?
Gillian Martin.
The member says that every year the SNP have been in government, the health service has got worse. We should not accept that funding is up by 50% under the SNP. There were 14 billion coming this year, and there's 14,300 more staff than there were in 2006.
Annie Wells.
I welcome the increased funding from the UK government, absolutely, I do. That's why you've got the money to spend on it. But listen to the end, listen to what I'm saying about when we're talking about numbers of people. Sorry, I need to make progress. I'm halfway through and I'm not even halfway through my speech yet. But this isn't the fault of our staff, not at all. They do their absolute best in dire situations caused by these blunders. Those are the headline problems under the surface. It gets even more depressing. Doctors and nurses don't get to do the job to the best of their ability because of the workforce crisis that's been created. The Royal College of GPs expect there to be a shortfall of 856 doctors in Scotland by 2021. And that's only going to be made worse by the ageing workforce of... I've got too much to get through, sorry about that. Yes, it is a debate and I've taken an intervention. Thank you very much. And let's not forget either that Audit Scotland have found that the SNP will struggle to meet their promise of an extra 800 GPs over the next decade. And away from GPs, the problems are just as severe. There's an increasing lack of nurses and midwives. Recent figures showed 3,826... Actually, I need to make progress, I'm sorry. Recent figures showed... 3,000... Am I allowed to carry on? Recent figures showed 3,826 full-time nursing and midwifery posts for qualified and support staff were vacant. There were 802 more vacant nursing and midwifery posts in September 2019 than in September 2018. This is the cost of a distracted SNP government, more focused on finding and inventing grievance with the UK government than stepping up and sorting out the problems in our hospitals. I'm in my last minute. So how do we fix this? How do we start treating our NHS staff with the respect and support they deserve? The UK government's huge funding increase to the Scottish budget over the next few years means that there are really no excuses for this. And I will try and close on time, Presiding Officer. As my colleague Miles Briggs has stated, we've set out plans to support the health and wellbeing of NHS and social care staff. One of those policies includes free parking for NHS staff, which really seems to be the bare minimum we can do for doctors and nurses and all staff who make our health service what it is. We've set out ideas for better mental health support, more financial advice, health checks and sleep pods in hospitals for NHS night shift staff to rest after shifts. All our plans have one thing at their heart, freeing up our NHS and social care staff to focus on what they do best, caring for patients. We shouldn't take the NHS staff for granted any longer. Let's support them and give them the backing they deserve for being there for every single one of us at every single time. Thank you.
Call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, just at the very outset, I think for Annie Wells's benefit, there are more GPs in Scotland in comparison to England and Wales. There are more hospital consultants in Scotland in comparison to England and Wales. And there are more qualified nurses and midwives in Scotland in comparison to England and Wales.
Would Stuart McMillan take an intervention?
Okay.
Emma Harper.
Thank you for taking that intervention. And I know you're sitting beside me. I would just like to ask Stuart McMillan if he agrees that Brexit's not helping when we're seeing a 90% reduction in nurses and midwives registering from the EU.
Stuart McMillan.
Unsurprisingly, Emma Harper is absolutely correct with that point. And I mean, some people might actually want to laugh at it, but unfortunately, Brexit is going to have a negative effect upon, many aspects of society in Scotland, including the NHS.
Miles Briggs.
Then, why did the former Health Secretary, the now First Minister, cut the number of student nurses and midwife places when she was Health Secretary?
Stuart McMillan.
Mr Briggs, this Scottish Government, this SNP Scottish Government, has actually increased their numbers each year for the last 8 years. So I think Mr Briggs needs to do a bit more homework. Presiding officer, not one person in this chamber could actually stand up in this chamber and say that the NHS is perfect. Not one person in this chamber could stand up and actually highlight that any organisation is perfect. And if they do, then they're lying. The NHS does have its challenges, but it's also a magnificent organisation that delivers, it saves, and it also rehabilitates lives. And it's absolutely right that members highlight the challenges that are faced in the areas that they represent, and sometimes a service that has not met the usual high standards. And every single one of us will write to our health boards, our local GPs and the health and social care partnerships on a regular basis, highlighting cases for our constituents. And if we do see a pattern developing, then it must be highlighted and also addressed. Now, sometimes, however, there does seem to be a portrayal, and we've heard it already today, particularly from the Tories, that the NHS is close to Armageddon if we listen to some of them. It is not. By talking down our NHS, it actually does not help the morale of the staff.
No, it doesn't.
It puts them under even more pressure, and on top of the extra demands that are happening to the NHS, it actually will make it harder to recruit the people into the service that we require. I've already taken two, Mr Johnson, I'm sorry. Monica Lennon's motion highlights a few things. Now, one of them being about the public inquiries into NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and also NHS Lothian. And it's right that the public inquiries need to happen. And it's the public deserve to know what actually has happened. I will not disagree with her on putting that in our motion. It's the taxpayers' money after all. However, if the inquiries didn't happen, then this Scottish Government would have been accused of trying to brush everything under the carpet. And on a similar note, with both health boards being escalated to level 4 and the additional measures that have been put in place to examine the areas that are clearly haven't operated as they should, this should be welcomed. Now, there were calls to put in special measures because of the concerns regarding the health boards. And if the Scottish Government didn't introduce the escalation process, they would have been accused of trying to cover up. Now, thankfully, the Government didn't do that. The Government put these measures in place, and I think that's the act of a responsible government. The aim of this intervention is to ensure that the development of a robust recovery plan is put in place that can move the boards forward to an improved position on performance and also on issues as quickly as practicable. I've already taken two, Ms Bailey, I'm sorry. Monica Lennon, she had two asks in her motion, and I have actually been to a few of the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board meetings that she talks about in the motion. Both the current and previous Cabinet Secretaries were actually in attendance, as were Labour politicians. And secondly, committees of this Parliament regularly bring people to provide evidence. Now, I was a member of the Audit Committee when I was first elected in 2007. And we were undertaking the inquiry into NHS Western Isles, which was an absolute basket case. And I'm sure if someone wants to do a wee search, they'll find basket case actually on the official report. Because at one point in time, it had 3 chief executives on its books. The one that had been put under gardening leave, the one that came in to actually fix the problem, then had to get put in gardening leave, and then the one that came in to actually fix the problem. Now, in my own local constituency, I'm sorry, in the last minute, in my own local constituency, there are challenges, and I have raised these issues directly with the Cabinet Secretary and also with the Health Board. But I also welcome the positive actions that have taken place. The building of the Orchard View Hospital is a continuing care facility serving extremely vulnerable people. I also welcome the building of the new Greenock Health Centre that's taking place. That's going to be a state-of-the-art facility in my constituency. And thirdly, Inverclyde was used as a pilot area for the minor ailment service, and that's now been rolled out elsewhere. There are areas of progress, but also some challenges One of the challenges being the out-of-hours GP service, and it's something I have raised directly with the Cabinet Secretary and also with the Health Board, and it's something that clearly is an issue of concern, and it is still going on, and it does need to be fixed. But certainly the Tories in London, they could actually help fix this problem if they sort out the pensions and the overtime issue that's actually having an adverse effect upon GPs actually wanting to go and do some of the out-of-hours. Now, on the 11th of March, when the Tories have their budget, hopefully they will fix that particular problem, but I doubt it. Now, the UK government certainly have got they've got a bit of a cheek on this particular issue. This is the Tories, but on this issue, some people who are a bit more cynical would probably say that this is maybe one way of the Tories trying to downgrade the NHS so they can actually sell it off when it comes to some type of trade deal with the USA. Anyway, I am conscious of time, Presiding Officer, so thank you very much. And genuinely, I will support the Scottish Government, who are actually trying to make sure our health service is fit for purpose.
Yep. Look at John Pilger's.
Now, we're running out of time even for interventions, so please bear that in mind. Anna Sarwar, followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by putting on record my thanks to all our amazing NHS staff and make it clear to any of them that any criticism, any failure that is highlighted, or indeed any intervention that is made by the Cabinet Secretary is despite their efforts, not because of their efforts. Because it is very clear now that all is not well with our NHS and that we do have systemic problems. A lack of strategic direction, poor management, a lack of accountability, a culture of secrecy and cover-up, with an end result that every day in Scotland, patients and their families are being let down. And it cannot go on like this. 2/3 of Scotland's population now lives under a health board in special measures. 2/3, more than 3.5 million people. 6 out of 14 NHS boards in Scotland in special measures. If that is not a sign of systemic failure, what is? And it's not isolated incidents. Mental health services failing patients in Tayside. Patients being failed at the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow. A new hospital not opening in the Lothians. Health boards unable year on year to manage their budgets properly. The law on waiting times being broken over 250,000 times. And last year alone, over 500 children waiting too long for mental health treatment. Staff suffering with sickness absence rates higher than they should be in every single health board. Reports of staff bullying up, vacancy rates up, treatment waiting times up. The only thing going down under this SNP government is life expectancy. But I recognise that this mess is not of Jean Freeman's making. She is trying to clean up the mess that has been left by her predecessors. The reality is she is trying to clean up the legacy of Nicola Sturgeon when she was our Health Secretary. So I say to the Cabinet Secretary directly, sticky plaster approaches won't do. If you do the right thing, if you take the appropriate action, I will support you, but you do not have the luxury of time. And I want to turn to the leadership in Glasgow. What will it take for them to be removed? Over the past 2 years, 9 out of 14 boards have had a change of chief executive. The chief executive and chair of NHS Tayside forced to resign because of financial mismanagement. The chair of NHS Lothian resigned over differences with the Cabinet Secretary. What will it take for the clique in Greater Glasgow to go? They are responsible for cover-ups, for lies, for misinformation, patient deaths, but still in place. What will it take for those responsible to move aside? A catalogue of failure after failure by the leadership of this board, and in particular at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Equipment contaminated by blood and faeces. Faulty Grenfell-style cladding having to be removed. Wall panels falling from the building. Pigeon droppings inside the hospital, leading to patient deaths as a result. Repeated incidents relating to unsafe water supply, leading to closure of cancer wards. Patients being moved out of unsafe wards. Children having to go out of the hospital and go into hospice to get washed. The silencing and bullying of whistleblowers. Water reports that showed the week the hospital opened that there was a high risk, but the hospital still opened as a result. The true cause of patients' deaths being hidden from their parents. Infection reports being done by infection control doctors, hidden and suppressed. Millie's death not being reported to the Procurator Fiscal at the time it happened. And when whistleblowers did speak out, the spreading of misinformation and outright lies from press releases from the Health Board. The way that Millie's parents have been treated is unacceptable and frankly disgusting. Every single day for 3 years, they are having to relive the tragic loss of their daughter. And all the while, we have a Health Board leadership that has ducked, that has tried to dither, that has tried to be evasive, has tried to bully, has tried to silence, and that's simply not acceptable. So I say to the Cabinet Secretary, what will it take for you to lose faith in these people? What will it take for you to remove this failing leadership? What will it take for you to remove that failing Chief Executive and failing Chair of that Health Board? Because the public have lost confidence in that Health Board leadership. Patients have lost trust in that Health Board leadership. Parents have lost trust in that Health Board leadership. We all deserve better. The parents deserve better. The public deserve better. Patients deserve better. And I tell you this, I will not stop until Millie Main's parents get the justice they deserve. So I implore you, do the right thing. Remove that Chief Executive, remove that Chair, and ultimately remove the people responsible for what I would regard as a crime scene. Remove them from that crime scene. Get a truly independent investigation in there so we can get the answers that Millie's parents deserve, so this never, ever happens again, and we can restore trust in our much treasured and loved National Health Service.
Gillian Martin, followed by Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is absolutely right we're debating our health service, the scrutiny of the most vital of public services, how it's run, the outcomes they meet or not. Well, that's our job as MSPs, and anyone who's ever lived in a country with no national service will understand how fortunate we are to have healthcare free at the point of need and staffed by dedicated, caring professionals to whom we owe so much. When a government's health spending goes down, or ministerial decisions that are made which endanger the fundamental principles of healthcare for all, or decisions that impact negatively on staffing, we should be jumping up and down, absolutely. And, Presiding Officer, I guess that's why I can't take anything coming from the Tory benches seriously when they talk about the NHS. What I see in our government managing this NHS is a government that's increased spending in real terms in every budget since they took office, and taken targeted action when required to improve patients' experiences. And this is often done under a great deal of pressure. These pressures include an ageing population, the constraints of fixed allocation of block grant, and more recently, immigration policies in the offing that do not take Scotland's need into account, austerity measures. Yes, I will.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful for Gillian Martin giving way. I agree with her that we want to improve patient experience, but does she agree that sending patients time after time a letter that says they'll be treated in 12 weeks when they have to wait 40 weeks or 50 weeks is not improving patient experience?
Gillian Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. For every satisfied patient, of which we have got surveys that prove that most patients are satisfied, there's always going to be those that are let down. And that's our job as MSPs, to make sure that our health boards are looking at that as well. And that's the job of the government, to have schemes in place, which they do, to improve waiting times. Anyway, I'll carry on with my speech. I was going to mention that austerity measures from the UK government impacts on people's physical and mental well-being. That's a pressure. And the cessation of freedom of movement in the EU, and withdrawal of research funding from that institution as well, is an added pressure. NHS staff are bearing the brunt of pension squeeze by the Tory government, which is inevitably leading to staff retention issues. Despite these pressures, in the proposed budget, we see the highest ever allocation of Scottish Government budget to our health and care sector, over £15 billion. That's a record amount, and I don't think anybody here can dispute that. Staffing levels are up to a record high. It was this government that put forward a safe staffing bill. Emma Harper talked about it in her speech. As a result of our efforts, staffing levels are up 11% from when Labour left government in Scotland. There was nearly an 8% increase in nurses and midwives, despite what anybody in the Tory benches tries to assert. We have protected the student bursary for nurses. It's the highest in the UK. It's scrapped in England completely, and it's only a quarter of the amount in Wales of what we offer in Scotland. And the Auditor General, people have been quoting him here today, but he said last year we've seen more people being treated on time than ever before in Scotland. But still, you do need to improve on waiting times, because, as my colleague Stuart McMillan says, if there's even one patient unsatisfied with the service that they've got, then we always need to rectify that. But, Presiding Officer, this motion highlights a lot of negative points for debate, and that is Labour's job. It's where the SNP, it's what the SNP did when they were in opposition and Labour were in power. Back in the days of a Labour coalition-run Scottish Government, the SNP challenged Labour on the fact that we had limited NHS dental places. When we get into power, we sorted it. There's now 96% of the population registered with an NHS dentist. We complained about the waiting times too. Particularly, we complained about the condition of the ageing hospital estate. Rightly so, it was in a shocking state with underinvestment for years. And when we took power, we put our money where our mouth is, and we embarked on the biggest capital investment programme in the NHS estate ever since. In my area, I'd like to turn to my area, we've seen a Forester Hill Health Campus Energy Centre project, a new emergency care centre, a new major trauma centre, new Aberdeen Community Health and Care Village, a new dental school at ARI, a new children's hospital at ARI, new breast screening facilities at ARI and across the Grampian area, new Inveraray Health Care Hub was opened for the first time last year. And we look forward to the new Baird Family Centre and the new Anchor Centre opening on the ERI campus. Record investment brought about by the government, who in opposition complained about the lack of it, but had a suite of proposals to put into action and delivered on them. Now, like many of my colleagues, I had to look at the Labour manifesto that brought Monica Lennon into Scottish Parliament in 2016. Under their proposals, NHS Grampian would be looking at a 13.7% reduction in budget if Labour were in charge. That's a £136 million loss compared to what they're getting with an SNP government. And, Presiding Officer, I have to say that I'm also very disappointed that the Labour motion neglects to mention mental health. In my area, we've got a new dedicated CAM centre invested in by the SNP government, opened last year, providing a modern care setting for adolescents with serious mental health diagnoses and reducing referral waiting times. We've put in plans to put counsellors in schools for early intervention as well. I'd like to gently say that anyone in a shadow position with the underlying ambition to one day doing the job for real in government may want to reflect on whether their motion or speech brings any solutions or serious demands to the debate. If a motion like this is just a litany of complaints with mere two asks of government, demands that have already been met, then one might wonder that person what they might bring to the post if they were ever in government. I would suggest that the shadow person in Labour takes up Jean Freeman's offer to sit down and come up with constructive proposals, because if they don't, it's just carping from the sidelines.
Edward Mountain, followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I truly would like to thank the Labour Party for bringing this debate to the Chamber today. Let me be clear, under this Scottish Government, NHS Highland has risen to level 4 on the escalation framework and is struggling with a series of crises. £30 million deficit this year after numerous deficits year after year, 3 chief executives in 15 months, mistreatment targets in nearly all areas. And finally, when it comes to leadership, we hear from the GMB union that bullying identified over 18 months ago is still going on. And furthermore, there is no evidence that action has been taken against the bullies that were identified in the Sturrock report. Now, I know from meetings with healthcare professionals that they feel undervalued and unsupported. And I want to be clear that I believe the NHS Highland have the best doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals. And so we should be careful to make sure that their positions are protected. But asking them to do the impossible with limited finances places unbearable and unrealistic stresses on them and their families. And doing so, in my mind, demonstrates poor leadership. Presiding Officer, I will never forget the motto on the cap badge I was given when I joined the Army. It said simply, serve to lead. A simple motto that some managers forget when they get into the offices that go with their appointments. And it's one that we need to ensure that they remember. Remember, because putting service before self and spending more time looking after those below you than those above you will ensure that those that do follow you do so enthusiastically and are prepared to go the extra mile without even needing to be asked. And I believe that NHS Highland have lacked and still lack that leadership. And I want to give you one example to show this. Presiding Officer, in October 2018, I was contacted by a mother who was worried about her daughter. A mother who was worried about the child that was finding life too much. Her child was a nurse that was struggling at work. Now, I contacted NHS Highland, and when I finally got hold of the chairman of the board, I was told not to worry, there was a process, and that the nurse's manager would make contact. That didn't happen, and matters dragged on. Only last week, I was approached again by that nurse's mother. Again, I wrote to NHS Highland and was told not to worry, a process was in hand. I replied saying that that frankly wasn't good enough and that a more personal and compassionate approach was needed. NHS Highland still haven't responded to that request. And now, Cabinet Secretary, you have the correspondence, and I look forward to seeing what you will do. But that leadership, Presiding Officer, that I believe is being demonstrated by NHS Highland is not a form of leadership that I recognise. It lacks true compassion and humanity. Now, in the short time that I've got left, I'd like to turn to the issue of performance. This government in 2011 promised Scotland a treatment time guarantee of 12 weeks. Yesterday, I checked online to see how NHS Highland was doing. In the quarter ending September 2019, NHS Highland was the worst performing board in Scotland, with only 57% of patients receiving treatment in 12 weeks. Now, Presiding Officer, I spoke to somebody last week who was waiting for a hip replacement. They can't walk properly. They can't sit down for more than 5 minutes. They only sleep for 2 hours a night. And despite that, they have to go to work every day. And let me tell you, they work hard. And believe it or not, they still find time to smile. But they've been told by the NHS that the waiting time for a hip operation is now 46 weeks. 46 weeks, Presiding Officer, that's nearly a year. A year of pain and suffering and no sleep. They couldn't face that. And nor could I. And nor, may I suggest, could you. And no one, frankly, should have to. So the solution they've chosen is to raid their savings and pray for a private operation. Money they shouldn't have to pay because they paid tax all their life and expect, like I do, for healthcare to be free at the point of delivery. And do you know the most galling part about this, Presiding Officer? Is that within a short time of booking their surgery, they received a call from the NHS saying that they would be delighted to know that they'd been removed from the waiting list that they never got anywhere near the top of. And that, to me, is truly galling. So, Presiding Officer, this motion to me identifies the problems our health boards face with poor management and poor performance. The issue, of course, is how to resolve these problems, and I have plenty of ideas on how we could rebuild our cherished NHS, which one day all of us will need. And let me be clear, I'm prepared to work across this chamber to make things better, as is my party. But to start with, we need to lead and look after the excellent frontline staff that we have, that we're not doing at the moment. And if we do, we'll get the best from them. But to do so, we need good leaders. And Cabinet Secretary, let's be under no illusion. Leaders are guided from the very top. So let's be honest, the problems our NHS face today are caused by the very leaders that seem to blame everyone else for their own failings. But let me tell you, the people of Scotland see through this, and we know where the blame lies. I'm afraid, the Cabinet Secretary, the blame lies with the Scottish Government.
Thank you very much. I call John Mason to be followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to speak. As others have said, there is a lot of good in the NHS, and a lot of patients have had a very good experience. Colleagues like myself may get messages through Care Opinion, which are sometimes critical, but often positive. For example, this was posted by a service user from my constituency 2 weeks ago. Quote, "Unbelievable care received from all staff at Stobhill MIU tonight. In under 1 hour, I left home, travelled to MIU, was checked in, triaged, assessed, x-rayed, diagnosed and treated for a wrist fracture. I feel this is a world-class healthcare in action, thanks to SCN Lisa, the reception staff, healthcare assistant and radiography staff for a first-rate service. Nurse-led care, in my opinion, the way forward for Scotland. Well done, all." Now, unfortunately, we do not see many opposition members sitting a happy patient in the gallery here and saying what a good experience they have had in the NHS. Rather, we see a suffering patient installed in the gallery and their case raised in the chamber as a way of bashing the SNP. And I have to say that I think this verges on abuse and is not the way we should make decisions about healthcare in Scotland. Now, I wanted to touch on some specific points in the Labour motion, not at the moment, no. Firstly, I would suggest that the Labour motion is contradictory. It says it, quote, pays tribute to NHS staff, unquote, but also says it has serious concerns about governance and leadership. Maybe Labour means that they pay tribute to junior staff, but not to senior staff. Well, I would have to disagree with that. We have many managers and senior staff, as I think Alex Cole-Hamilton was saying, who are doing an excellent job, albeit within tight constraints. Labour are greatly overstating the problems in the NHS. I suspect they will accuse me of being complacent. I am not. Of course there is room for improvement, but let us keep things in perspective. Otherwise, staff get discouraged and patients get unnecessarily worried. Okay.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm just wondering what perspective a closed hospital down the road provides him, and what perspective a hospital the other end of the M8 that makes people sick gives him.
John Mason.
Well, I think that's an example. To say a hospital that makes people sick, the statistics show that the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is not an outlier compared to other large hospitals of similar size and dealing with similar specialities. No, sorry, I can't take one after another. Now, as it happens, a number of us, MPs and MSPs, attended a Greater Glasgow and Clyde briefing on Monday. Now, some of what was said may have been confidential, but I think a lot was already in the public domain. So that has helped me form a clearer view of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital situation. The word scandal is in the Labour motion, but I do not think we have reason to call it a scandal. There are different definitions of the word scandal, but one is, quote, an action or event regarded as morally or legally wrong and causing general public outrage, unquote. Well, I do not think we have yet established if there has been an action or event that is morally or legally wrong. My feeling from what I have read and heard is that there have been a whole range of issues which have sadly led to infections and deaths amongst young people there. And I hope we all extend our sympathies and concerns, as others have done, to the families involved. We shall understand more once inquiries and other work are concluded. But it is not my understanding that the QEUH, as I've said, is that different from similar hospitals. Our thoughts do go out to the families, and the loss of a young person is always a tragedy. But as members all around this chamber know, sadly, infections and deaths have always happened in hospitals and have been reducing, both here and elsewhere, in recent years. Sadly, this is likely to continue to be the case. Healthcare has moved on amazingly in my lifetime, and many people, both younger and older, are alive today who would not have been living in the past. No, I'm sorry. I certainly, not after the way Mr. Sarwar spoke. I mean, to talk about a crime scene is absolutely ridiculous, it is outrageous, and totally undermines the NHS. Because of what you said, no. But sadly, if death is caused by negligence or deliberate harm, yes, let us hold someone to account. But I am afraid that every death is not preventable, and we need to be mature in facing that. The BMA briefing for today makes the point that we need, quote, a more mature and less blame-focused approach to targets, and I would agree with that. On the question of escalation, I remain uncertain whether or not this was necessary at the Queen Elizabeth. Of course, there is always room for improvement, but I think the Health Board management is taking this very seriously. The motion also mentions performance, and I would like to make a few comments on that. One of the measures of performance is always A&E waiting times, and that is fair enough. However, the reality is we have people turning up in A&E who do not need to be there and could more suitably be dealt with somewhere else. That includes my own mother, who has been referred to A&E a number of times, aged 92, and it is not the best place, I'm convinced, for her to be. And fourthly, the Labour motion mentions financial sustainability. All very well. But again, we are left to wonder what Labour means by this. If they mean let's have more money for the NHS, would they cut local government to pay for it? But if they mean putting more resources into primary care and potentially cutting resources for hospitals, then I think that is worth looking at. Financial sustainability includes living within our means. It does not mean always hoping for or demanding more money, but never explaining where that money will come from. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, absolutely we should stand up for the NHS, for the staff and for the patients, but I hope the opposition will also be prepared to look at the difficult challenges in a mature and balanced way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I call Daniel Johnson to be followed by George Adam?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The NHS is a remarkable institution, and in a sense, it will always be under pressure. And in that, I would agree with the Cabinet Secretary, what she made in her opening remarks. Ever-expanding knowledge and technology means we can do ever more. Growing expectations mean that we want the best for those that we care about. And a population that is living longer means we often have more conditions that are more involved and require more prolonged intervention. And there are many issues faced by our NHS driven by those forces, and austerity only exacerbates them. But in my view, at root, the most fundamental element of the crisis we face in our NHS today is not solely born from lack of resource, though the broken waiting time guarantees and spiralling levels of bed blocking outlined by other members are there for all to see. No, in today's NHS, we have a brand new hospital costing £1.4 million a month to keep closed, and another hospital whose water and ventilation systems have caused infections and caused deaths. And can I just say to Mr Mason, he should look at the official report and think about how his words would sound and how they will read to anyone affected by the issues and circumstances at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. But the reality is we have a health system with both those issues, with Health Board chairs resigning, Health Board chief execs sidelined and sacked, and 2/3 of the population living in Health Board areas under special measures. These are not issues driven by demand. These are not incidents created by cuts. These are signs of bad decision-making and poor governance. Any examination of either of these beleaguered hospital projects tells us that there is something fundamentally wrong with oversight, accountability and basic decision-making in our NHS. In the Edinburgh case, the Sick Kids Hospital has remained shut with no committed opening date because ventilation systems are not up to standard in critical care. But the board signed off a contract variation to downgrade required ventilation rates. The variation reduced the standards for 4 bedrooms, but no one thought to join the dots or ask the question whether the 4 bedrooms in critical care would be impacted. Worse still, it was a Health Board document that provided the contractor with the incorrect ventilation standards in the first place, a typo that will cost millions, if not tens of millions of pounds. And if the situation in Edinburgh was bad enough, the situation in Glasgow, with questions regarding whether key facts were suppressed, raised even more serious and sinister concerns. In 2017, Health Protection Report showed a spike in hospital-borne infections, yet no action was taken. It took political pressure for this to be acknowledged and acted on. It took a whistleblower for the board to even get in touch with those infected, including, most tragically, those whose family members had died. In both situations, the basic oversight we expect did not happen. Critical questions were not asked. Processes to ensure compliance with standards were either not in place or not up to the job to identifying those issues. Ultimately, in both cases, there seems to be a basic problem with health boards' ability to make decisions and ultimately take responsibility, all exacerbated by a culture of obfuscation and secrecy. These are failures in governance of the most fundamental and most serious nature. And these governance failures are not confined to Lothian and Greater Glasgow. Nationally, the Auditor-General criticised the financial management and lack of long-term planning by the SNP government. 4 health boards are in the highest categories of special measures, with serious allegations of bullying plaguing others. In the last 2 years, 9 out of 14 health boards have changed their chief executive, with only 2 boards having had the same chief executive for more than 3 years. That's a management turnover that would make Manchester United blush. And with such fundamental failures exposed, when the public's trust is so badly dented, we have the right to ask, where does the buck stop? Who will take responsibility? We have reached a point where these glaring errors in governance must give rise to a fundamental question about the government. It is not good enough for ministers to hide behind the excuse of structures. And while I recognise Jean Freeman's commitment to making progress, we cannot treat these issues as simply circumstantial and to be dealt with by process. These are systemic issues that must be treated as such. And ultimately, the government must take ownership of a system that has been shaped by 13 years of SNP stewardship and ultimately summed up by a hospital that can't be opened and another hospital that should not have been opened. Now, I understand the Cabinet Secretary, given her 20-month tenure, clearly is not to blame for all these issues, but she must take responsibility for what has gone wrong. And if she wants constructive engagement, and I welcome that, she must begin by acknowledging the seriousness, the gravity, and the scope of the failures that have taken place. Only then can we have serious engagement. Only then, when we hear the government was not treating this simply as business as usual, can we all get together and look at these problems. Because ultimately, unless the government face up to the issues that they have created, they will be letting those hard-working staff down, but they will also be letting all of us down, all of us who depend so much on our NHS. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call George Adam to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, sometimes I listen to debates in here and wonder if the opposition parties live in some alternate universe from the rest of us and cue laughter and noise from the opposition. Miles Briggs spoke of the real-world scenarios. Sometimes I wonder if he actually knows what the real world is. Possibly he's a stranger to it in himself. But don't get me wrong, Presiding Officer, I've just started. I'm aware of the challenges that the health service faces, and I believe we need to be looking at ways to address them. But my constituents, Presiding Officer, appreciate the NHS and the people who work hard within it. They value, when they really need medical support, our Scottish Health Service and the people who work within it are there for them. Many of my colleagues in the Health and Sport Committee probably are too polite to say anything when I mention my wife Stacey, who has a daily fight with multiple sclerosis. But today again I find myself talking about how well our health service supports her and people like her who are dealing with long-term conditions every day. Is it always perfect? No. But what it is to their life, it can make a difference to everyone's life. Now I will stand up and say, when I give you this example of what happened this week, Stacey went to see her consultant regarding her ongoing mobility issues. She believed it wasn't going to get any better. Her story is the same as thousands of men and women with multiple sclerosis in Scotland. She went along to the assessment, and within minutes, the consultant came with a solution to her problems. Within minutes of receiving 5 Botox injections, she walked from the treatment table to her wheelchair. And to many that might seem trivial, but us that was close to a marvel. Once the consultant worked out what I did for a living, he started to talk to me about the NHS. See, this consultant doesn't just work in Glasgow. He works in London as well. And he said he saw the massive difference between our NHS and that in England. He used the Botox injection that he just administered to Stacey as an example. In London, he told me, that he would have had to have got 5 separate signatures to get access to the cupboard that had the solution in it. In Glasgow, he just went, unlocked it and administered the solution. He did tell me that there were challenges in Scotland as well, but he was happier when he worked here. Stacey is now happier than she had been beforehand because our health service had worked for us. So I know only too well that the NHS is our most important public resource, and we must do all we can to ensure it remains properly funded. On that particular issue, Presiding Officer, let's look at what Labour offered in their 2016 manifesto. They proposed to fund the health service in real terms, which all sounds good and dandy until you look at what that would mean. If you look at this year alone, it would mean a cut of which the Cabinet Secretary has already said of £1.4 billion on our health service in Scotland. £1.4 billion, Presiding Officer. So the Labour Party's plans would cut the health budget by £1.4 billion this year, and they come and lecture us about how the current state of our health service. If you look at the figures, yes, no problem.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank George Adam for taking the intervention, but George Adam agreed with me. Actually, the £1.4 billion pales into significance. The fact that it would have been £2.4 billion since 2016 if it had followed Labour's manifesto commitments.
George Adam.
Indeed, Mr McMillan is correct, and he's gone to the next part of my speech, was that we were going to actually say if we had stood with it, it's over £2.4 billion. You know, Presiding Officer, press releases are all very easy to do, but being a government is hard work and proves how far the Labour Party are from ever being in government. The current facts that our NHS are record high health funding, health and social care will rise to more than £15 billion for the first time under the 2021 budget. Patient satisfaction has 86% of people rating their full inpatient experience positively. NHS staff by over 14,300 or 11.3% to a new record high level under the SNP in 2006-2019. Patient safety over the last 5 years have been decreasing year-on-year trend in both MRSA and C. diff infection compared to where we were in the past, Presiding Officer. And I look at this and I see constituents come in day after day, week after week. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are difficulties. Yes, we have to face up and we have to have the mature debate. But I would say to colleagues within this chamber, let's have that mature debate. Let's not chase the headline. Let's not chase the press release. Let's make sure that we have this mature debate about one of our national treasures, which is our health service. Because at the end of the day, it's people's lives that we're dealing with, and it is a health service that every one of us in here absolutely values entirely. Presiding Officer, it's very easy for some to criticise the Scottish Government and our NHS. What is difficult is coming up with solutions to these challenges. That's the work of government, Presiding Officer. That's the work of those who take up the responsibility to move things forward. I would say in closing, Presiding Officer, it's time for the opposition parties in this place to take up that responsibility.
Thank you, Mr Adam. Can I call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by James Dornan?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just remind the Chamber that I have a number of close family members who are doctors and nurses within NHS Scotland. Can I start with a very obvious point, Presiding Officer? Health has been devolved for 20 years to the Scottish Parliament. It is our responsibility, it is the Scottish Government's responsibility. They are the ones who are responsible for it. And for some of the other benches to be always hyping on about what is happening in other parts of the United Kingdom seems to me not willing to take responsibility for what's been happening here in Scotland in the last 20 years. In a moment, but not quite yet. I am a regional member here for Lothian, and so I want to concentrate most of my remarks around that. As we've heard from other speakers over the last couple of hours, NHS Lothian is in a very perilous position. And it's a position that is not just about administration, although that is ultimately important. But what is even more important is that it's going to have an effect on patients here in Edinburgh and the Lothians, and it's going to have an effect on families here in Edinburgh and the Lothians, and we're already seeing that. And that is what we're talking about. You know, we can have arguments about numbers, we can have arguments about how we feel about things are going, but ultimately, what is happening under this SNP government is that patients and families are being let down, and you have to take responsibility for that. Here in Lothian...
Minister Clare Hockey.
Taking my intervention. I hear Mr Balfour complain about this government comparing the NHS in Scotland, which is the best performing NHS in the UK, to the absolute disaster that the UK Tories are managing in England and the Welsh Government in Wales. However, I think it's a valid point to compare the NHSs across the 4 countries, given that the members sitting on those seats think that they could be the next Scottish Government.
Jeremy Balfour.
I generally don't quite follow the point by the Minister there. I think the point is that we are responsible for Scotland. If you maybe concentrated more on what's happening here in Scotland and what's happening in the rest of the UK, we'd be in a lot better place. So here in NHS Lothian, we have no longer a chairman of the health board. We have a chief executive who is leaving over the summer. We have a hospital that is lying empty. And yet we hear no apologies at all from the Scottish Government. 8 years late, the Sick Kids Hospital might open. And it would be interesting whether the Cabinet Secretary, in her closing remarks, would confirm that the new date will be the date that the Sick Kids hope opening, because the rumours certainly...
Secretary.
Because I'm not actually making the closing remarks, my colleague Ms Hockey is. Two points. I am happy to confirm that what I set out in terms of the Sick Kids Hospital in Lothian remains on track in terms of that timeline. And I'm also grateful if the member would acknowledge that on more than one occasion in this chamber, I have apologised for the fact that that hospital is not open, but I have not apologised for making sure that it stays closed until it is safe for patients and staff.
Jeremy Balfour.
Well, I am grateful the Cabinet Secretary has confirmed that date, because certainly there are a lot of rumours around the city that that will not happen, and so I hope that she is correct in regard to that. However, we have to work out why did Scottish Government ignore the problems around the Sick Kids Hospital. Either they turned a blind eye, or they simply didn't want to engage with the subject. And that is not just where the crisis ends. If we look at the rest of the estate within Lothian, we see what is going on in St John's Hospital, with departments having to close and not being open all the time. We see the Eye Hospital here in Edinburgh, which has major structural problems, and yet there's not even anywhere in an infrastructure programme for that to be renewed. There are problems upon problems upon problems. But actually what that leads to is what we hear from those at the Coalface office. We hear from the Royal College of Nursing that 60% of their staff say they're under too much pressure. 60% say that they cannot give the care that they want because of the lack of staff and the work that they are doing. That is the reality that people are facing today across Scotland in our hospitals. As we sit here debating it, we have hard-working doctors and nurses and physios and cleaners who are going way beyond what we should be expecting of them. And the people that are responsible are not them, it is this government and their lack of failing. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, with maybe a slightly more positive request to the Minister or Cabinet Secretary, and that is around changing places, toilets within our hospitals. I am pleased that the government in the planning bill have agreed that any new hospital will have a change in place toilet, and I think that's a really positive move forward. But there are many hospitals in Scotland today that do not have that facility, which means people who are elderly or people who have children who have disabilities struggle to be able to change them and clean them and keep them appropriately when they're going for hospital appointments. And I would welcome a conversation with the Scottish Government of whether we can see changing places toilets not only in new hospitals but across the estate here in Scotland, which would open up and make it much more easier when people have to visit hospitals, either for outpatients or to visit people who are in hospital. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Balfour. And I call James Dornan before we move to closing speeches. James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just say to Jeremy Balfour there that I agree the health service has been devolved for 20 years, but that's probably precisely the reason why it's the best in the UK. Now, before I start my comments, I want to exempt Anis Sarwar and Daniel Johnson, I think, from them. I thought both of them were very good contributions from the Labour benches, and nobody can fault Anis for his consistent campaigning on behalf of the family of Millie Mayne. But I can't possibly support this motion, because this motion seems to me to be another one of these motions where we are forced to sit and listen to the Labour Party attacking one of our most beloved and hard-working organisations, whilst at the same time dressing it up as if it's concerned for patients. You're not in the Labour Party, Alec. You're not in the Labour Party. And it seems to be with no consideration for the morale of a workforce which goes above and beyond on a daily basis to improve the lives, not just of each and every one of us here, but for every individual who chooses to make Scotland their home. Service is still free at the point of need and is the envy of countries across the world. It's shameful, though not surprising, to hear Ms Lennon criticise the Scottish Government, but whilst forgetting to mention the administration that's failing so badly in Wales, the same party she wants to see in control of the NHS in Scotland. Now, I knew that we were going to get, same old Wales, coming from colleagues over there, but, Presiding Officer, if Labour are in power in Wales, and we can only use their statistics as a benchmark of how they would do it here, remember, after all, they claim all the time that Labour are one UK party. So let's not pretend that it's got no relevance how you're doing in the only place in the UK you still manage to hold on to power. I'm sure that'll change at some stage. An organisation of over 160,000 employees will always have difficulties. And yet, look at the staff surveys. The staff surveys, overwhelmingly, the staff see themselves as being supported by their line manager and others. This does not sound like a health service where the staff are hating going into work every day, where the staff don't see themselves as being respected in any way. The First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary are fully committed to a health care improvement plan, and there's no question that in particularly uncertain political and financial times, the Government in Scotland has put the protection of the NHS and its funding at the forefront of its agenda. If not, then tell me why we usually have to defend ourselves from attacks that we are spending too much on the NHS, instead of, there's a long list of things here, spending money on local, why aren't we spending more money on local authorities, transport, this, that, the other, whatever it is that you want to get your press release from that day. If you're serious about caring about the health service, then you should be supporting the extra money that we put into the health service and not looking to make a long list of complaints, because we can do that about any service.
Mr Jordan, I wonder if you could just move your microphone just towards your mouth.
It's not often I get asked to do that, Presiding Officer, but thank you very much. I see that's not been met with universal approval. But in the last budget, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance committed an extra £454 million to NHS frontline services, aimed to improve waiting times and patient outcomes. This has been welcomed again by staff and patients across Scotland. We've all received NHS complaints. That's part of our role. But speaking for my office, I can only conclude that the number of complaints, although all serious, certainly to the complainer, received are nowhere near in proportion to the number of constituents whose lives are improved by top-drawer care and support. Constituents often talk to me about how the NHS and its incredible staff saved their lives or lives of loved ones, or simply changed their lives for the better. So what does the NHS do? Care for us at the point of need without judgment, supports families, helps 4,500 births were registered in Scotland, which were brought into this world safely by an army of midwives, nurses, doctors, health visitors, healthcare supporter workers and countless others. With GPs who during summer heat waves and winter storms risk their own health and safety to brave adverse conditions. With hundreds, if not thousands, of professionals who attend our ageing population. We've got physiotherapists, occupational therapists, podiatrists and home care support workers travelling across cities and rural areas to take care of the most vulnerable. So let's not pretend this is a health service that's not up to the job. Let's not pretend this is a health service that's in crisis. This is a health service with some serious difficulties. And I respect the concerns that are raised about the two hospitals. But what are you suggesting? That we open them because we need to have it opened? Let's make sure it's safe first. Let's make sure they're safe, and let's make sure we get the patients in. You know, I've had a member of my family who recently had a stroke. From the minute that we found her in her house, We called the ambulance. There was a first arrival within minutes. There was a second arrival to take her to the hospital. She went straight to the Queen Elizabeth. She was treated absolutely impeccably by the staff at the Queen Elizabeth, and she still is just now, and she will be until she's well enough to get back out and looked after with the care services at home. Now, that's the sort of thing that we need to be able to talk about as well. All we hear from the opposition are, we love the staff, but the health service is rubbish. And this is the reasons why it's the government's fault. It has to be more nuanced than that. George got it right. If you're going to have a serious debate, don't just come with complaints, come with some solutions as well. And so far, we've not heard any of that from any of the opposition. And I'm sorry, I've only got 15 seconds to go, so nobody's getting an intervention. Listen, this government is committed to improvement with financial resources increased and new strategies implemented. And it's our jobs as members to support these changes and to thank some of the hardest working members of our community for doing some of the toughest jobs around, not to come here to try and get publicity on the back of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Donnan. And we move now to closing speeches. I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Claire Hockey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start with declaring an interest in it? One of my daughters is a medic working in the Scottish NHS. I can also thank the Labour Party for bringing this debate to the Chamber. And note once again that it is in opposition debating time that we get the chance to debate health. You have to wonder what it is the Scottish Government are afraid of. Well, we're given a right old list, Presiding Officer, of issues today of which the Scottish Government should be rightly embarrassed, if not ashamed of. Opposition Speaker after Opposition Speaker have listed a litany of ways in which this SNP Government has failed our healthcare professionals. Monica Lennon was quite right to raise the continuing which this SNP Government has failed our healthcare professionals. Monica Lennon was quite right to raise the continuing catastrophe at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital of the contamination of the wards and the deaths of young patients was realised and then action was taken. Yet Health Protection Scotland had identified the risks as far back as 2016. And I have to say to Mr Mason, which I thought was a disgraceful speech, I wonder if he realises that 10-year-old Millie Main's death has now been referred to prosecutors 3 years after her death, and maybe you would consider how your comments will be taken by those parents who are watching at home. I thought it was an absolute disgrace. We've heard how the Six Kids Hospital in Edinburgh still hasn't opened 8 years after it was supposed to. It failed a last-minute inspection of the ventilation system. We then discovered that the Scottish Government and the Health Board knew about these problems as far back as 2018. As was raised by Miles Briggs, there is a culture of bullying emerging again in the health service. The Sturrock Review was an independent review of bullying in NHS Highland, which was relentlessly championed by my colleague Edward Mountain. We've had 100 radiographers walk out in Ayrshire and Arran citing bullying. Now, I've raised the issue of bullying in the ambulance service with the Cabinet Secretary in the Health and Sport Committee, and she admitted that she'd had similar approaches in her surgeries. And there's other MSPs have added their voice to that concern. The RCN stated that more than 1 in 3 of their members have experienced bullying. More than 1 in 3. The BMA briefing reports similar concerns. Presiding Officer, there is strong evidence of a systematic culture of bullying across the NHS. And these are hardly new revelations, but they do have a devastating effect on retention of staff. And I have to ask the Cabinet Secretary what you're doing to remedy this, especially given the recent revelations following the resignation of the Chief Executive of Lothian. As Alex Cole-Hamilton mentioned there, there's a claim that was mentioned, a culture blame, of the Scottish Government. Now, Annie Wells brought up the workforce crisis, and it has only continued to deepen. We have GP surgeries closing at an alarming rate, with 860 GPs short. We have a shortage of nurses, we have a shortage of midwives, AHPs and OTs and consultants. Staff are leaving because the environment in which they're being forced to work is not good enough. And again, the RCN report that 60% of their members responding to their survey state they are under too much pressure. So, let's get into this. During her tenure as Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon cut the training places for nurses. Now we have a shortage. And I'm going to say this to Emma Harper. There are no shortages of applicants for midwives, yet there's only space for a fraction of the applicants. And guess what? We have a shortage. Physiotherapy applications outstrip places 4-1. And the Scottish applications for medical school are now capped. And we all know of Scottish straight-A students rejected by Scottish medical schools because of a lack of course availability. The net result is an understaffed NHS, resulting in levels of stress-related illness in the NHS at unacceptable levels. We actually need to give them the time to deliver the expertise that they have trained for. And again, I'm going to say to Emma Harper and Stuart McMillan and Jane Freeman and Gillian Martin, there are no shortages of applicants from Scotland to work in our NHS. There is just a chronic lack of training places available, and it's really disappointing to hear the Cabinet Secretary and her cohorts hide behind Brexit. This is a crisis that has been... I will take an intervention from the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr Whittle. I don't believe I hid behind Brexit at all. I simply pointed out, as many others across our country have done, is that it does have an impact. That's all I'm asking you to acknowledge. However, I would also ask you to acknowledge that in the last 8 years, we have increased the number of midwife and nursing training places. We've increased the number of medical school places. We have increased the number of AHP places. If you want us to do more out of that proposed £50 million budget, which I hope you will vote for, then I would welcome a discussion with you about which other parts of our health service you want me to cut the resources for in order to increase the training places in any of those areas.
Brian Whittle.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention. I'll just point out to the Cabinet Secretary you've just been given £700 million more to spend in the NHS by the Barnett consequence and the Barnett Yes, well, you're asking... See, it's not just... Stop... Stand up and speak if you want to speak, but the point of fact is, it's not even just about how much money you've got, it's what you spend it on. I'm just still answering the Cabinet Secretary. Just to point out, you are right, Cabinet Secretary, you have increased the training places for doctors of 800 up to 2029. The problem, of course, is, according to Audit Scotland, the Scottish Government couldn't give justification for that arbitrary number. And they went on to say, they suggested that in current trends, the most likely outcome is you'll still be 664 GPs short. There is no... You have to show your workings. So let's be clear here, Presiding Officer. We have a world-class medical staff trained to the highest standard, prepared to put patient care above their own needs. The Scottish Government are giving them a very poor standard of environment in which to work. Miles Briggs set out our plans to support the health and well-being of NHS staff and social care staff, including free parking, mental health support, financial advice, health checks and sleep pods in hospital. I would throw in access to a hot meal 24/7 and the time to eat it. And if you add these very achievable options together, you get a significant investment in the health and well-being of our healthcare professionals. Presiding Officer, the message is very clear. Put the health and well-being of our healthcare professionals first, because they deserve no less. Warm words from the Cabinet Secretary is not a substitute for the actions that will demonstrate that we care. And if the Scottish Government refuse, the increasing strain on the service of an NHS, the service our NHS deliver, will become unsustainable. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call on the Minister Claire Hawkey before concluding with Sarah Blair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As with healthcare systems across the world, our NHS in Scotland is facing increasing demand and challenges that require long-term sustainable solutions. But we shouldn't forget that our NHS does deliver a first-class service, and while there are areas that need to improve, I would like to echo the Cabinet Secretary in paying tribute to the admirable work carried out on a daily basis by our healthcare staff. And that's why, Presiding Officer, it saddens me that time after time we hear from opposition speakers praise for our NHS staff, while in the next breath condemning their performance. To hear the phrase medical mafia used in this chamber from a member of the Labour front bench is truly shocking. I echo Alison Johnson's statement that the NHS should not be used as a political football. The tone of debates such as this do little to show the high esteem and value that I, as an NHS nurse of over 20 years, would wish for my former colleagues. Recently, I was informed by a chair of an NHS board visiting staff in a highly pressured area, and they asked what they could do to help. The staff's answer was, make them stop saying bad things about us. This is the direct effect that some of the rhetoric that comes from this place has on our NHS staff day in, day out. and demoralises them. And I can tell you that because I've heard it. If I can answer some of the points raised by those in this debate and calm down some of my anger that's obvious, given some of the things we've heard here. Miles Briggs raised the issue of car parking. This SNP government abolished car parking fees at all NHS-owned hospitals, at all NHS-owned car parks. So that saved over £39 million for staff, patients and visitors. And the Tories supported Labour with their PFI car parking building scheme. Annie Wells raised issues over vacancies. Scotland has more GPs than anywhere else in the UK, more consultants, more nurses and more psychologists. All of this raised on a day when the Tory UK government announces a new immigration policy which will affect nurse recruitment because they may not reach the visa points threshold for staff nurses, and carers may not reach the visa point staff threshold either. And they're people that we need in this country to look after our most vulnerable, and yet they've been labelled low-skilled. What is low-skilled about empathy and compassion and building trust with those who are the most vulnerable in our society? And I'd be happy to take Miles Briggs' intervention on that point.
Thank the member for taking this intervention, because having just said what she said, and she took a long time before she allowed me to ask this, why will she not now commit to taking action to lift the parking charges NHS staff face here in Edinburgh, in Glasgow and Nine Wells? That's what Parliament's calling for. That's what you can do. The UK government's providing £7 million. It will cost £2.7 million to do that. Will you commit to doing that? It will make a huge difference for the NHS staff who work at these 3 hospitals.
Minister Claire Hawking.
I would then challenge Miles Briggs to tell me what part of the NHS he wants to cut. What part of the NHS do you want to cut? All of the budget that is coming to the NHS, including consequentials, has been accounted for. We have record levels of investment in the NHS in Scotland since this government took office in 2007. The plans for 2021 will take the total health portfolio funding to more than £15 billion for the first time, increasing funding for frontline NHS boards by £454 million. That's £1.4 billion more than would have been available to invest in 2021. Based on Labour spending plans from the last Scottish election, as we heard from George Adams. And, Presiding Officer, that's equivalent to 40,000 nurses. The NHS England budget was cut by 5%, £1.5 billion between 2010 and 2019, while in Scotland this government has increased it by 13%. So I'll take no lessons about budgets from Tories. But, Presiding Officer, supporting improvement is not just about money, it's about how we use it. And a substantial proportion of those resources have been invested in expanding our workforce, with overall staffing numbers up by 11.3% since this government came to power. That's over 14,300 additional whole-time equivalents now working in the NHS. We recognise that these staff are our greatest asset and that we must strive continuously to deliver the best possible employee experience. The iMatter Staff Experience Report of 2019 shows that overwhelmingly staff in the NHS feel that they are treated with dignity and respect. That's 78%. And that their manager cares about their health and well-being. That's 80%. But we do know that problems occur and we can always do more. And that's why the Health Secretary has commissioned the multi-agency short life working group on culture to look specifically at what more can be done to promote consistent behaviours, effective relationships and enhance confidence and trust across the workforce. And those figures on staff experience stand alongside the statistics from the 2018 Scottish Household Survey that overall public satisfaction with local health services remains high at 81%. The Cabinet Secretary spoke earlier about our commitment to whole system reform and the impact of integration of health and social care. And that commitment can be seen through the range of improvement initiatives that we've put in place, including the Waiting Times Improvement Plan, the 10-year mental health strategy, the development of national health and social care integrated workforce plans, and the programme of wellbeing taken forward by the Scottish Access Collaborative. The progress being made through the implementation of these plans and initiatives is tested through a continuous cycle of scrutiny and support. Annual reviews are a key component of the work that all NHS boards do in partnership, and we review their performance across 3 key areas: staff, clinical and financial government. And of course this process is about accountability and scrutiny, but we remain committed also to working with leaders across the service to respond to the challenges we collectively face. Before I go into my conclusion, can I address a point that Jeremy Balfour made about changing place toilets?
There's no time. I'm afraid you're already over time. You have to conclude
Okay,
now.
well, we'd be happy to discuss that with you. Supporting the government amendment is the best way to stand up for our dedicated NHS staff by making sure they continue to receive the support and investment that is vital to deliver those services for the benefit of current and future patients of the NHS in Scotland.
Thank you very much. And can I ask Sarah Boyack to conclude our debate?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We owe it to the staff in the NHS, we owe it to our constituents, and we owe it to everybody who needs those NHS services to ask the questions we have posed in this debate today. That is the job of all of us, regardless of whether you are in the government front bench, somebody else's front bench, or you're a backbencher. Our job is to represent our constituents. And there are fantastic pieces of work carried out in the NHS every single day. And if you ask all of us, we will all know of somebody in our family whose lives have been transformed or saved by that immense work. But it's also our job to highlight where there are issues, governance issues, leadership issues, performance issues, and financial sustainability issues. And those are the core issues in our motion today. It's about standing up for our NHS by making sure it is the best it can be. And we must not ignore the impact on NHS staff of the pressures that they have to deal with that are internalised. It's already been mentioned, but the RCN experience of 60% of nurses believing they're under too much pressure at work. It echoes surveys by the Health and Social Care work that was done last year on staff pressures, and the BMA survey that looked at the pressures on doctors. So we know there are pressures on staff. We know there is a huge issue about how resources are actually used in practice. And it is important that we hear from the voices of staff, because their hard work is crucial to the success of our NHS services. But we also have systemic problems here, and we are not doing our jobs as MSPs if we do not acknowledge the fact that 6 of our mainland health boards are in special measures. That is not normal. That is not acceptable. There are reasons why those health boards are in special measures, and we need to learn from those facts that has put them into those special measures. A brief point.
Miles Briggs.
For taking this intervention. Does she share my concerns that the Cabinet Secretary hasn't outlined why the Chair of NHS Lothian left and what these concerns he had with this government's control of the NHS Lothian were?
And could members please keep the noise down? Sarah Boyack.
There is something unprecedented about this debate on one level. All of the MSPs in Lothian, except for the government MSP, signed a letter on the 5th of February because we were all concerned. Whether there are good or bad experiences, they need to be fed into the system, lessons need to be learned, and people's voices need to be learned. That is absolutely crucial, and that is why we have said there's both an issue about the Cabinet Secretary having regular meetings with health boards on an annual basis, something Labour introduced, but also that we make sure that there's transparency and that where people have left and we have a high turnover, we listen to them, not uncritically, but their voices need to be heard, because if we've got this systemic crisis, it does need to be addressed. This is one of our most important parts of Scotland, is having a successful NHS. None of us are going to disagree with that. And it's not about being negative about the SNP government. It's about wanting to make our NHS in Scotland the best it can be, with a huge amount of resource that goes into it, and to make sure it's better. And that is standing up for our staff, and crucially, it's standing up for our patients as well. And the passionate speeches we've had across the chamber is testament to that. The comments made by Jackie Bailey and Ash Sarwar about what has happened in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital project and the wider impact on health, and the comments that they made need to be listened to. This is not just about a waste of money. It's about what can be life transforming. It can be about tragic and heartbreaking experiences when something goes wrong. And governance and accountability is critical, because that mustn't happen again. And patients who have died, people who have lost a child need to know that lessons have been learned, and that's what this is about. And I have to say to those SNP backbenchers saying that opposition members have been critical, I have to tell you, back in the day when there were Labour health ministers, they did not escape their own backbenchers holding them to account and being critical when it was appropriate. So that's our job. And our particular job as opposition, and let me move on to this, is to be positive and constructive. And if you look at the terms of our motion, we do praise the fantastic work of our health service, but we have those two key points about making sure that the Health Secretary and her team are in regular touch with the health boards, that they know what's happening on the ground. Let me just give you the example. All of us in the Lothians area met with NHS Lothian recently. We knew that the Chief Executive was retiring. We didn't know at that point that the Chair was going, but we were constructive in our questions to the Health Board. And one of the things that I think many of us were concerned about was we don't actually know definitively when the sick kids will open. And there are issues about processes, and I think the Cabinet Secretary needs to hear that directly from those that are involved about how those processes work. Can they be improved? Because there are a raft of health projects underway at the moment that need to be looked at. And that's not about being critical for the sake of it. It's doing our job of making sure that things are as good as they can be in the health boards. And I want to finish on a point. It's also about relationships with the health boards. It's about our relationships with local government, and it's about how our IJBs are working. We had some excellent evidence in our Local Government and Communities Committee today about how do we spend money both in the health service and by our local authorities. And one of the key pressures is the front line of the NHS being able to look after people, make sure that they get the treatment when they need it, and make sure that they leave the hospital when they are healthy. I had a fantastic briefing along with Richard Leonard last night from Age Concern Scotland, and the cost to people of being stuck in hospital is not just a financial cost, it's a health cost on those people. And we need to make sure that the whole of our health system works, from the preventative health side, from making sure that the care service works, and to having a joined-up approach. And that's why accountability and transparency is crucial. We can't make assumptions. When things go wrong, they need to be fixed. And the people involved in that process, it's not just about being critical, it's about coming up with solutions, it's about learning lessons, and it's about, with the benefit of hindsight, could you have done things differently? Should you have done things differently? And that's what our motion is about. It's in the interest of our NHS that we don't just work together and we don't just praise what's good, but we make sure that when something goes wrong, there are consequences, that we learn from that, and that money is spent to the best effect to benefit all of our constituents. That's why we've held this debate, and that's why I hope you'll vote for both our motion and amended as a Conservative motion, because there should be no pressure on our staff. And when we have got whistleblowers, they need to be listened to and they need to be acted upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate on standing up for NHS staff and patients. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20904 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thanks very much. No member is asked to speak in the motion. The question therefore is that motion 20904 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. The next item is consideration of business motions 20906 on stage 2 timetable for a bill and 20907 on the extension of a stage 1 timetable for a bill. Could I again call on Graham Day to move these motions?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And again, no member has asked to speak on those motions. So the question is that motions 20906 and 20907 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of 5 Bureau motions. Could I ask Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau to move motions 20908 on designation of a lead committee and 20909, 20910, 20911 and 20912 and approval of an SSI.
You're also cruel. Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So we turn to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 20882.3 in the name of Jean Freeman, which seeks to amend motion 20882 in the name of Monica Lennon on standing up for NHS staff and patients be agreed? Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment 20882.3 in the name of Jean Freeman is yes 59, no 61. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that Amendment 20882.1 in the name of Miles Briggs, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Monica Lennon, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. I think someone was a bit confused about shouting out no there. The result of the vote on amendment number 20882.1 in the name of Miles Briggs is yes 120. There were no votes against, no abstentions. The motion is agreed. The next question is that motion 20882 in the name of Monica Lennon as amended on standing up for NHS staff and patients be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on motion 20882 in the name of Monica Lennon as amended is yes 62, no 58. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. Now, I propose to ask a single question on the 5 Parliamentary Bureau motions, unless anyone objects. Does anyone object? No, that's good. The question is that motions 20908 to 20912 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Gil Patterson on the Cocknow Stone and the social value of Scotland's prehistoric rock art. But we'll just have a short pause while members and the Minister change seats. Yes, a short pause.